Hi, welcome to Connecting the Dots, the podcast where we share our stories from the battlefield of consulting. I'm your host, Johnny Hill.
I'm Sarah Slate.
I'm Ryan Brady.
I'm Chris LaCava.
Hey, I'm Kareem Jamal.
Today we're talking all about the art of the possible. Let's get started. So let's just start off by defining what the art of the possible is. What does that mean?
I think when you frame it as like a consultant and you think about a consulting engagement, what you're trying to do is get the constituents that you're working with. So those could be users, customers, it could be other consultants, but you're trying to basically get them to think a little bit divergently and think outside the box, basically out of their comfort zone to reimagine things in a potentially disruptive way, like technology disruptive, not disruptive bad, or be innovative.
Yeah, I think a key part of it that comes to mind for me is like asking the questions, okay, what do we have access to? What skills do we have? What kinds of ideas do we have? And just kind of like you're saying, Chris, taking all of that and saying what's something we can do different with that? Are there things we could do better or differently? Whether it's a new product that like we're trying to come up with ideas with, or just a different way of approaching things to maybe differentiate yourself, or even just saying, hey, we have access to this information, but it's not represented very well. How could we do it better? How could we make it clearer? Sometimes it's creating something new, and sometimes it's asking, is the way we're doing things now actually the best way to do it? Or are we just doing it that way because that's how we've always done it?
One of the words Chris said, whether or not he meant it that way, was divergent, right? And reminded me of the movie, right? Where it's like people are sort of set in their ways and they're sort of beaten to follow these rules. And Art of the Possible is really to have those divergence, sort of take the gloves off and open your mind and see what else can be done despite what you've been locked into or told repeatedly over and over again that it has to work this way, right? Take a moment to step back and explore with a much wider lens.
When I said divergent, I was speaking about something like very specifically around design thinking, like the design thinking term of divergent thought versus convergent thought. And they're like both equally as important, but they happen at different points in the process. So when I think about the art of the possible, it's like you want to unshackle yourself from whatever the constraints or conventions are, give everyone permission basically to think in divergent ways. And later you come back and put the convergence in and you start to put constraints around it. When I said that, I was specifically thinking about that aspect of divergent thought.
Yeah, it's like a part of brainstorming when you're saying, let's not worry about how realistic this is. Let's just come up with ideas. And in that step in the process, it doesn't help to worry about, well, how will we accomplish that? Or what are the limitations? But just say, well, what if? And that I think that's a key part of it too.
What are the drivers of the art of the possible? Like, what causes you to even step into this territory?
Excess capital.
But I think that's a great way because you say capital and everyone thinks money, but there's a lot of value in things like you might have this data set that you know is valuable and you know you're not like realizing its value. Or a new technology comes out, a new framework. Maybe the idea is there that you could apply it, but you're not sure how.
Yeah, I think for one reason or another, there's a recognition of opportunity to differentiate yourself or to do something new or different and saying, okay, what could that look like? How can we approach that?
Yeah, and I think like the currency of, well, technology industry, but specifically consulting and technology is that your return on investment is that you bring new or novel or more efficient ways of thinking about things. So to stop and think about things differently and have actually like a framework and being able to name it, I think is, to Ryan's point, like one of the drivers. A lot of ways you're trying to justify your existence as a consultant, to say it slightly cynically, by being able to expand people's notion of what is actually possible. Like the best win is when they say, well, I never thought about that, but yeah, that seems obvious or simple or like, wow, I wish I had thought about that a long time ago. That's kind of when you're doing these types of exercises, that's like a really beneficial outcome that you're striving for.
Mhm. Something that at least came to mind for me when we're talking about the art of the possible is it's often coupled with some sort of proof of concept, or you're kind of playing with things, or kind of like Ryan was saying, like what are the factors that may bring it about? So I think it's worth asking, like, how is a proof of concept different from, or maybe fosters the art of the possible? But also, how are they different? Because there may be times where you're exploring the art of the possible, but not in the context of a proof of concept.
I think it's like when you do a proof of concept, especially one that's like semi-functional, you're taking the dare that if someone says, "Oh, that can't be done," or "that won't work," or whatever, it's almost like you want to you want to like say, "No, like this is in fact possible, and here is a concept, and maybe even a working concept that shows that it is possible." So it's kind of like the end result of that argument, almost like I said, taking the dare,
Mhm.
that you couldn't possibly do that. Oh yeah, well, we put this together and in fact it is possible.
Yes, it's taking those vague ideas and making it something a little more tangible, right? And you don't have to tackle all of it. You're taking a subset of it possibly and saying, look, here's how we can make it be in reality, really. And then you can go play with it and then we can explore a little more. And so it's sort of taking that nebula of organic matter that's floating around and then sort of putting it together and condensing it into like a little planet or what have you. But it's showing that it can happen. More things may gravitate towards it over time. It's almost like a sort of a fire starter or that first stepping stone into taking the sort of the vague, intangible into the tangible realm.
Mm.
I guess I keep thinking of it in my mind as the art of the possible is more like the broader vision, right? And then, a POC is a specific step to kind of validate a piece of the vision or that part of the vision.
Yeah, kind of jogging back to what we were talking about before. If the art of the possible is saying, let's not worry about how we do it, just let's think about what we could do. Yeah, the proof of concept is taking a piece of that and saying, okay, now let's talk about how we could do it and prove that we can. And then maybe that's, it may go back and forth. You may have like, okay, we're taking a step of exploring the art of the possible and playing with different ideas. Okay, we'll take a step and see if we can actually build it. Cool, we can. All right, let's go back and explore what we can do with that again. Now that we have something tangible, they can kind of go back and forth.
And sometimes you may need a POC to make the customer really expand and believe into the art of the possible, right? They may be so closed into what they've been working on and have set those own boundaries that sometimes you need something quickly stood up for them to say, oh, yeah, look, as Chris
Mhm.
was saying, like, this is possible. Let's prove it out. And then they're like, oh, man, you're right. No kidding. It is possible with what we have. Then the true sort of art of the possible uh,
Mhm.
exercise really begins. And we're really good at standing stuff up quickly to be able to show that to where then they have that sort of light bulb moment. And then the conversation really gets interesting.
Yeah. Yeah, you might not get buy-in from a bunch of ideas that you generated, but you can get buy-in from showing, hey, here's how we can make it work, or here's an example, or here's a demo.
Yeah, it's a lot easier to get people excited about pictures or even better, moving pictures or interactive pictures. So a lot of times it's just like, a picture says 1,000 words. If you describe the thing, people may not get it, or they may get it, but they get it intellectually. But if you show them a picture, a lot of times they get a lot more bought in a lot quicker. And it de-risks a lot of things. So when you get out of that divergent state and you start to put constraints on things, it also de-risks a lot of stuff. Sometimes we build a concept on the most risky technical aspects of things to make sure that our divergent thinking is in the realm of reality.
Let's talk about what it practically looks like to explore the art of the possible. Maybe some of the exercises you'd go through, the things you'd do to explore that.
Yeah, there are a lot of cool, like in the design world, there's a lot of cool design thinking exercises like Crazy Eights, if you guys have ever used that. There's also a thing where it's similar to Crazy Eights, but someone starts a design and then passes it to another person. and they have to add to it. There's all kinds of cool, like crazy games to play in that initial like discovery ideation phase of design thinking.
Yeah, something that came to mind for me is just thinking about like a hackathon environment where you give someone a vague prompt or problem to solve and say, cool, go figure it out. You have 48 hours. Here's some pizza. Like you kind of put people in a pressure cooker and say, here's the problem. Figure out however you want to do it. And oftentimes it can be a really sticky problem, or it may be like a simple problem, but there's some sort of, rule that you have to, throw in there to keep things creative. But almost like that artificially created environment of pressure and like time constraint to really force people into a different way of thinking. And I think Chris, you were kind of speaking to that too. Like some of the exercises, they kind of create an environment where there's a sense of like you're moving quickly to kind of just you're not so that you don't have time to overthink it. You can kind of like take an idea and run with it without getting burdened by all of the little nuances and what ifs, which there's a need to address at some point, but not at that point in time.
Yeah, and if you see some of those like classic design thinking things where people are all co-located and they've got a big board and it's like multidisciplinary, it's encouraged to kind of be silly and not censor any idea. Like you want quantity of ideas. And the crazier the ideas, a lot of times the better. And what they'll say is like a lot of really good ideas came because someone shook up conventional thought because they put some crazy thing up there that was completely ridiculous and they might have even done it as like a joke, but someone built a real idea on top of that because they saw another thing that it was paired with.
Mm-hmm.
And you get that kind of discontiguous type of idea generation. It expands what the possibilities are almost immediately. It gives permission for people not to self-censor their ideas or worry about what other people are going to say about them.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think that's very important. If you start shooting down any ideas or making comments too soon, then people will automatically shut down and you won't get that creativity. So, yeah, be sure to watch yourself and your facial expressions as part of these exercises. And the traditional ways of sort of sticky notes and whiteboards is always great because people in private without any comments are really writing down their stuff, and then everyone goes at once and puts their ideas up, right? And so if you know the person's handwriting, maybe you can figure out who did what. But it's still a good way to have the ideas generated without being pre-filtered all at once. And you may have to help sort of get them into that mindset. So you might have to do some exercises to prime them up, right? Like, hey, those types of, what do you want to be when you grow up type stuff, right? So you may have to ask some of those types of questions first to get them into thinking about, the endless possibilities, and say, if you had unlimited budget and time, what is the one thing you would change today? Right?
Mm.
Those types of things, and just take off pretty much all the limits and the bounds that they're working in, and let them really explore, and then you can start refining on some of that.
Mm-hmm. That's interesting. That makes me wonder, like, this is more just an open question, but do you feel like having a group of people that don't know each other particularly well is better or worse than having a group of people that maybe have worked together for years on multiple different projects and you throw them all together and say, come up with ideas? I feel like familiarity makes people like more comfortable sharing crazy ideas, or it may limit you to like, well, we already know we would all approach it this way. So I'm curious what y'all think about that.
I'd say I'd meet you in the middle. Like it's good to have a bunch of people that work together for exactly that synergy, but I pull the same half a dozen patterns that I've learned out, and it's hard to get me out of that rut. If there's
Mm-hmm.
someone that's new in the room bringing a different energy, a bit different set of ideas, I'm more apt to kind of snap out of it. So I think like a mixture might I never thought of it. It's a really good question, but a mixture of people might be the right way to go about it.
Or maybe that's why you can throw in some of the crazy rules. Even if you all know each other, it's like you're approaching a problem in a way you never have.
Yeah. Yeah. That's what you're trying to induce for sure.
Mm-hmm.
But it's hard to find the time to actually run these exercises. And it's also hard not to kind of, like I said, bring your toolbox with you and not think outside the box. But when they're done to the playbook anyway, the original playbook, it's supposed to be super multidisciplinary. So it's kind of hard to do when we're all either developers or designers. But even within those groups at Expero, there's so much diversity and experience that I think we still get good results. But yeah, I mean, you're supposed to bring in all kinds of people. At that point, everyone is kind of like pitching in on the design aspects of it.
I would say another part of it is when we talk about art of the possible, then you want to think about new things, but really, I tend to find more success applying something I know and something I've done to something new. Instead of going completely green fields, entirely something new, it's like I've done this, but I did it differently. And I could do it here. And what would that look like? And what could that do? And that's really what I like about my job at Expero is all the different projects and all the different industries I've looked at. It's like I solved this problem in logistics. It looked different, but here's the same problem again in finance. And look at that. I could solve this problem here. And all of our different experiences that we bring to the room is part of what makes the possible.
Yeah, I love applying things that have worked in other areas to different domains. It doesn't always work out, but that's a great way of kind of thinking about the art of the possible. And you know, you have a lot more assurance that it's possible because you've seen it operate in a different setting, but a lot of those things still apply on a lot of the cases, especially when you're talking about analytics and looking at certain, you know, patterns in data and things like that. But this is like where I've tend to lean on a lot of like generative AI stuff because I can describe a problem in one area and be like, well, where else does this apply? And it's really good at kind of like just talking to the internet and being like, hey, internet, if you were to think about this, like how would you think about it differently? So it's yeah, that's one thing like in this process, it's great to use some of those tools, trust but verify. Like obviously they tell a lot of fibs sometimes, but it's a good way to actually use generative AI to allow you something that you can describe really well in a certain setting and say, where else does this apply?
It's also a good place to apply the old saying that a little bit of knowledge is dangerous. Can get you into trouble without a full understanding, but you know, that's part of the game. That's part of how you
That's the
learn.
art of the possible. The
Yeah.
actually getting out the other side is like future me's problem, or maybe someone else's, I don't know.
Yeah, let's keep pulling on that thread a little bit. I know, generative AI and AI tools have changed a lot in a very short amount of time. How can you leverage those tools in exploring the art of the possible, or even coming up with ideas for how to look at problems differently, or getting out of a rut if you're, having some writer's block, so to speak? What are some ways you can leverage those tools, and maybe some of the things to watch out for too?
It's a yeah, the big thing with the AI and generative is that it's very much changing every day. The growth is incredible, and any kind of rule that I might suggest today could be wrong tomorrow. So I guess one one rule is to be careful with the limits that you put on it. Like, don't be too ambitious right now, but you could probably be ambitious tomorrow.
I kind of wonder, this is one of my bigger just thoughts or concerns I've had with leaning too heavily on AI tools. If so much of the benefit of exploring these things and brainstorming in the art of the possible is coming up with ideas and finding connections between seemingly unrelated things, if you, so to speak, outsource too much of your thinking to an AI tool, you miss out on the potential to make those connections and think of things in a different way. Now, you can also leverage an AI tool to try to get out of the thinking patterns you have and recognize connections through that. But I think it's worth noting, like, if you're truly trying to shake things up and think about things differently, some of that requires original thought and creativity that you're probably not going to get, at least not right now, like Ryan was saying, from just asking an AI tool, like, hey, how would you solve this problem? So I think seeing it as a way to shake things up or have a jumping off point, I think is beneficial, but be careful not to ask the AI bot to be innovative for you and to make the connections for you and miss out on the potential learning that can happen and the potential things you can come up with if you do get a little crazy and creative and try to find connections between seemingly unrelated things.
Yeah, I think it's
Mhm.
still not a good replacement for creativity, although it does surprisingly well, especially ChatGPT at like writing poems and stuff. But, you know, pure creativity, it's still, I think we're still pretty far away from that. But I think the opposite might be true, where I find I waste a lot of time inventing things that have already been invented. So,
Mm-hmm.
like, it's good before you get too far, it's good to just ask whatever the LLM du jour or even a Google search on like if anyone's ever done this before.
Especially early on in the process, this is probably the only time I'd say that hallucinations might be acceptable because you're throwing stuff and seeing what sticks to the wall and what bounces off, and you're just throwing stuff all over the place, right? And so those hallucinations might actually help you think a little differently or question almost to the comical level. But sometimes you need that sort of kick, right? To just be go follow that wild idea and keep chasing that crazy chat, conversation, see where it really lands. And
Mm-hmm.
maybe it brings you somewhere into like a new area that you hadn't even considered before.
That's a good point. Yeah, and I mean, I think like a lot of these big multidisciplinary sessions that we talk about are really, really hard to coordinate, especially if you're on a budget and you're trying to do it as part of a consulting engagement. Sometimes it's hard to get people involved. It's a poor substitute, but it is a substitute where you can use generative AI to kind of bounce ideas off of, I guess. And it can kind of respond in whatever discipline or whatever voice you tell it to. It may not be accurate, but to your point, Kareem, maybe it's okay if it's not accurate because it just kind of gets your thought process going where, you can do something quick and dirty without having to pull together like a bunch of people for a big session.
I think we can definitely say that the new AI is changing everything about the art of the possible,
Mm-hmm.
opening new doors, and everything's going to be different.
So, what are some of the things to watch out for when maybe it's not the right time to explore the art of the possible?
There's a danger of drinking your own Kool-Aid with this stuff that you get so attached to an idea that you think is possible that you don't necessarily, you're not super critical sometimes about like if it should be possible. Well, not just can it be.
I think that it ties back to a previous episode we did on not building the beautiful wrong thing. You get so
Yeah.
excited about this looks so cool. Oh, I guess we got in our own head too much and we're convinced. I'm sure we could all think of certain AI startups that are seemed really exciting for their first announcement video and then crashed and burned because turns out people just want stuff on their phone, not things that you could clip to your shirt. Not naming names, but uh,
It's just before its time, man.
right. But yeah, that's a good point. Like as important as it is to not be critical in the early phase of exploring and thinking and being creative, you eventually do need to pull it back down to earth and say, okay, how are we going to do this? Is this actually worthwhile? Is this actually sustainable, like financially, whatever solution you come up with? There's all sorts of questions you need to ask that are not helpful to ask at the beginning, but are really important to eventually get to.
Yeah. What's the statement? There's like a famous statement that sums up what you just said. It was like design like 100% that you're correct, and then test like 100% that you're incorrect. Probably got that wrong, but like that's the idea of it.
Yeah, it sounds about right. You're so convinced that you're right when you're making it, and then as soon as someone else tries to use, you're like, oh man, this
Yeah,
is awful.
all in, like 100% full conviction, and then full stop, full reverse once you test it.
Well, and I think that brings up an important point too about the value of like testing your solution. It might be that, yeah, you need to radically rethink it, but there might still be something there. But if you didn't budget the time and the resources to go through that testing and revision process, you might be dead in the water before your good idea can actually become usable. So recognizing that you kind of need to build in time to recognize how wrong you are if you think that this idea is actually worth pursuing to the end, to the point where it's actually, feasible and producible.
Sometimes you just have to look at the problem and sort of face the facts. If there's limited time, limited budget, or if the task is so simple and straightforward or even mundane, right? You don't have to force the art of the possible on it, right? Like, hey, I need an export to Excel feature. Oh yeah, but what if we did this and like this great stuff? I just need to export the Excel feature. Oh, but what if we presented the data in this way and did this and this, and I just need to export the Excel feature. And you know what they really needed? An export to Excel feature, right? And so sometimes this is straightforward because your that user base is working 100% in Excel, and
Mhm.
that's what they need. And so sometimes you don't have to force it. It's always good to ask the questions because hey, sometimes you don't want to download a 4 GB Excel file to do a little bit of slicing and dicing, and you can give that summary data into some other way in the visualizing the UI. But sometimes that's just what they need because it's part of this long process that they have, and that's it'll plug right in. And so sometimes if you force it too much, you're setting yourself up for failure.
Mhm.
I have an overwhelming urge to talk Kareem out of an export to Excel feature. But I want to
Well,
tell him that's the wrong way to do it. He should think about other possibilities.
what's interesting though
Oh,
is we do very much have those interactions sometimes where for our end user or our customer, it's such a clear, simple process. But digging in and being able to ask the questions and dig deeper and say, in their mind, this is the solution, but the better solution is actually to do something different that they can't quite envision. I think that's where the art of the possible can come in and say, like, okay, it sounds like you use Excel a lot. What if, there's a different approach rather than just downloading it? What if we could do this or that or whatever that would actually be faster? So I think that's part of it, is learning that balance between, yeah, this is really just a simple process. This is all they want to do, and saying, I think they have a solution in their head already. Let's try to dig a little deeper and see like what's the underlying assumptions behind that. What are they actually trying to accomplish that maybe isn't a conscious thought, but it's there. So I think that's also part of reading the situation and knowing when it's time to push on it and when it's time to just say like, yeah, let's just keep it simple. So that can be
yeah.
tricky.
And
Yeah.
sometimes it just tells you that maybe you're focusing in the wrong place, right? Maybe
Hmm.
the export is what they need, but like the pre or post of their process to that, maybe that's where you should be concentrating on and seeing how else you can sort of, improve their experience there.
Yeah, that's the art part of this, I think, and you guys summed it up really good, but knowing when to push the boundaries and knowing when to back off or push them so far and then know, like, yeah, in fact, the mundane will say solution is actually the best one. And like, let's not reinvent the wheel here. Like, it's really hard to know where that line is and when to push it, when not to.
Yeah, sadly, some things are still not possible. I remember one client who had read some blog post and was convinced that this database could solve an NP hard problem in time. Was a misunderstanding,
It
and
wasn't a graph database, was it?
it was a graph database that they read a blog or some video that they had solved this problem in time. They didn't. They missed the fine print, but we lost a lot of cycles on trying to communicate clearly that actually it's still NP hard and not that easy to solve. Sorry.
There's also an aspect of the art of the possible that's like market sensing, or like seeing if it might be a great idea, but will it sell? Are people going to jump from the thing they are using to this new thing? And I almost feel like there's a whole subset of things that started as tech demos that people were like, I don't know, let's just release it and see what people think. And it either crashed and burned immediately, or it was so successful that it essentially became a product then and there, because it resonated so much with people, even though it was never intended for like release. I don't know. I'm curious how that can work into it. There's the aspect of knowing when to like kind of try to gauge if what you're creating is valuable or if people will show interest in it, but trying to not do that too soon to where like there's too much time that elapses between when you first talk about it and you actually release it, or you release it too early, or you show people too early and it's really messy and kind of crashes and burns from there. So I don't know, curious your thoughts on that aspect of it too.
Is that where trying to define and figure out what that minimum lovable product is to
Oh
put
yeah.
out there? Have that one hook feature that people love. Like, I feel like it's probably a boom of a bunch of apps years ago, and downloading many apps on your iPhone was new and cool. And we all like doing that. And they just needed like one gimmick to hook you and get you to use it.
If you're
And now
talking
I get
about
mad when I need to download an app for some service and I don't want more apps on
Exactly.
my phone.
Same,
And now that has
same.
totally changed.
I mean, if we're talking about the minimum lovable product, then should this be called the heart of the possible?
Ooh.
Oh,
I mean, I think the thing that you described is kind of like this radical lean software development methodology where like you don't get hung up. You just build stuff and you put it out there and you see who clicks on it and you build the smallest possible amount where you can basically fail fast, as for lack of a better term, or succeed and move forward. And I think like conceptually that's powerful and there are a lot of success stories around that. But there's a cautionary tale too, which is if you only operate in that mode and you only do it all the time, you have a lot of like non sequitur, basically tech debt out there, and you never execute on a larger vision, or it's harder to do because you're scattered and you've got things. It's not a black and white thing a lot of times where it's like, it's a great success or it's not. It's usually not that simple. It's like, it's kind of gray, and some people have kind of adopted it, and you don't necessarily know how to end a life it, and so it just kind of hangs out there, and you've got all of these things that in various stages of completeness. So I think that methodology is really powerful, but you can't be exclusive about it, and you got to be really careful with what you decide you're going to test that way.
And maybe providing some fallbacks too, right? So if they really don't like your revolutionary idea, they can fall back to some stuff, right? It's sort of a sliding scale of how much you really need to push forward and stand your ground with this new way of doing stuff versus just being, too stubborn and you should really back off, right? A little bit like, hey, categorizing email via labels, hey, great, revolutionary. But you know what? Some people, no matter what you do, will want folders, right? So you have to give them an option, which Gmail eventually had to do, right? Is like sort of visualize them as folders. It's a great idea. It still is. Lots of people use it, but lots of people just still can't grasp it that way because they keep modeling it back to their physical model, right? Where one piece goes into one folder, one piece physically can't exist in two folders, right? And it's like you tear it up and put it in different folders. I'd like to meet the person that does that. But so it's a sliding scale of like success to make sure the idea succeeds and has a sort of a fair fighting chance versus, hey, it's time. So don't get too caught up in it.
Thanks for connecting with us today. If you have a complex software problem that needs solving, thoughts on what we discussed today, or ideas on what topics we should tackle next, feel free to reach out to us at podcast@experoinc.com or on Twitter @ExperoInc. We'd love to hear from you. Thanks again for joining us, and we look forward to connecting with you next time.
Welcome to ZomboCom.
Sorry, don't mind me. I'm just getting distracted by the link that Chris shared.
Yeah,
Dang.
what is this?
Chris, what is this?
Oh man, this is gonna date me. But back in the dot-com boom, someone somewhere like they created this site called Zombo.com. And all it says is everything is possible with Zombo.com. And like I don't know how many gazillions of people played it, but yeah, I mean it just loops over and over again and tells you everything is possible.
Welcome to Zamboka. This is Zamboka. Welcome to Zamboka. This is Zamboka. Welcome.